Hello and welcome. My name is Raj Persaud and I'm a consultant psychiatrist based in London. And I'm delighted to be joined today by Magda Osman, who is a senior lecturer in psychology at Queen Mary, University of London. She's written a very intriguing article in the Psychologist, which is a journal, a professional journal that goes to all members of the British Psychological Society in Britain. And the title of the paper in the Psychologist is "Does Our Unconscious Rule?" And she's also written a fascinating book entitled Future Minded, The Psychology of Agency and Control. And it's published by Palgrave Macmillan. Now, there are many issues that come up in the book and the paper, and one key issue is the role of the unconscious in our lives, which is an issue that has kind of dogged and dominated psychology for many, many years. But I'm going to start off by asking you, Magda, you put agency and control at the center of your book and your paper. Why is agency and control important?
Well, I think the thing to think about is that virtually everything that we do in our lives involves some element of choice and some aspect of us acting. So we act in the world. Now, as soon as you bring those into the forefront, so you start thinking about what choice is and how we act, how we try to generate certain outcomes or produce certain things, then we automatically bring in the concepts of agency and control. So let me give you a very sort of humdrum day-to-day example. So I have a thought, I fancy a cup of tea. So that's the goal. I want to go and get some tea. So I have to perform a sequence of actions. So that's me doing something. So I have to go to the kitchen, I have to switch the kettle on and so on. So all of those things involve sequences of actions in order to produce a particular outcome. Now, the outcome in this case is that I make the tea. Now, my sense of agency is automatically involved in that as well, because I have to feel like I'm the one that can generate that particular outcome. So as trivial as that seems, it embeds all of these very important issues about agency and control, our belief that we can control things and the sequences of actions that are required to achieve the goals that we set ourselves that we feel are important. So that's why those are at the forefront, and those are the things that I consider to be important, because they underpin every aspect of every choice we make and every action we perform.
And could you define for us what you mean by agency of control? And also there seems to be a difference between whether we have agency and control over our lives and what our beliefs are about agency and control.
Yes, I mean, that's an interesting point, which is that I would say it's very hard to be able to establish objectively in the world the extent to which we have true control. So this becomes a philosophical issue, actually. But what psychology tells you is that the stronger one's belief or sense of agency, the stronger the belief is that I can control the things around me, the more likely you are to be able to achieve control. So this is why these two things are extremely important and intimately linked. So it's our sense of agency is key to being able to determine the things that happen to us. And yes, that's where a belief is an extremely important, very powerful experience psychologically.
Now, the title of the book is Future Minded. You're saying there's a very key link between our sense of agency and control and the future. And basically, we are kind of future machines. We are people, mechanisms, machines designed to try and produce a certain future or control our future. And that lies at the heart of practically everything we do and everything we think.
Yes, exactly. Any choice we make involves an expectancy of something that's going to happen. So that is that I presented with a choice between, again, something very trivial, tea or coffee, and I pick tea. So at some point I had to expect something that I would get in return, and even if the time frame in the future is very short, so it could be a second or a couple of seconds, it's still me making a choice about something that's likely to happen sometime in the future. But I think most people would probably think, when we're thinking future-mindedly or thinking about the future, we're thinking about much longer time horizons. But from a psychological point of view, as soon as you start talking about agency and control, when you're performing actions or you're making choices, they involve a change from the current state you're in and how you get to a future state, no matter how short or long that period is.
Now, one of the things I find really fascinating about your work, and I think it's fair to describe you as a kind of world authority on the subject of agency and control, is that practically every human problem comes down to this issue, which is that if you think about things like obesity, obesity is a problem because people make bad decisions at one point in time that lead to implications in the future, which are negative implications. They become fat. People get divorced because of their inability to predict or control the future in an effective manner. Bankruptcy, criminal behavior, getting in trouble with the police. Practically everything that goes wrong in our lives can be put down to this issue, that we're bad, often bad, at delivering a future that we would prefer.
Yes, that's one way of spinning it. So some of the greatest problems that we face are down to very bad lifestyle choices that we make. But while we can oversell the many problems that we see in the world as a result of that, there are many other aspects of our lives that are actually rather positive, which are precisely because we're very good at controlling aspects of our lives and thinking about the future. So not everyone makes very bad financial decisions. So some people do save money and do have pension schemes. Not everyone does, but some people do. But yes, you're right in that many of the fundamental problems concern bad choices that we make because we have very short time horizon. So we're only interested in the thing that is likely to make us feel better right now, rather than thinking about or delaying achieving something in the future that might be actually much better for us. But that doesn't undermine the general point that I'd be making, which is that whether we make good or bad decisions, all of those decisions are concerned with aspects to do with agency and control, and in order to make better decisions, then we have to tackle and understand what it is about agency and control that can position us into a better future.
But it seems to me that people that are successful, who attain their goals, are effective, who stay happily married, who are thin and fit, and rise up the greasy pole of office politics and run corporations and so on, the difference between them and the rest of us is their effectiveness in this area of agency and control and producing better futures for themselves.
I think the psychological evidence would be perfectly consistent with that, which is that people who have a very strong sense of agency achieve things that they want. So that is that if I carry a belief that what I do is likely to generate the outcome that I best want, then I will feel as if I can actually do that. And on top of that, I can figure out the strategies to get to that position. As soon as you start undermining your own sense of agency, so that is, you think, well, actually the world is against me, I don't actually feel I have much control over things, then that creates a negative spiral, which is that you're more likely to put yourself into situations which are uncontrollable or seemingly uncontrollable. Another issue is maybe this issue of resilience, which is becoming quite an important there's a important term that people are referring to these days. So many aspects, many experiences in our lives will be bad as well as good. So, you know, it might seem that these things are actually uncontrollable. Now, someone who is resilient, so that is someone that has a way of dealing with these problems and then moving on from that, or surmounting the problems, is someone who has a very strong sense of agency. You think, right, okay, well, this bad thing had happened to me, but I can either learn from it or I can find a way of making something better out of this situation. If you don't have a very strong sense of agency, then you'll feel like the world is against you, and you just use this as another example of how bad the world is and the fact that you don't actually have control. So all of these things are wrapped up. So yeah, some successful people are those people that have a very strong self-belief in themselves and their ability to control the world, but that doesn't mean that the rest of us can't think in that way in order to improve our own lives.
Now, the book begins with some very interesting examples of how we react very strongly when we have a sense that our agency and control is being taken away from us. And you gave the very interesting example of seatbelts and seatbelt legislation, that governments tried, particularly here in the UK, for many years to persuade people through advertising and so on to wear seatbelts, but those campaigns failed. So they had to bring in a law making it compulsory, but generally speaking the public reacted badly to that, yet it was actually in their interests to have their sense of agency and control over the area of seatbelts taken away from them. Could you say something about that example?
Well, yes. So actually, here's another. So within the same scheme, there's legislation concerning us driving and not using our mobile phones. So what happened with the seatbelt example is precisely what's happening now with legislation concerning while you're driving, you must not be on the phone. So this is because if you divide your attention between driving and doing something else, you increase the risk of crashing. But there are probably two reasons why people don't like being told what to do in these kinds of contexts, which is that people feel that they're actually, so the evidence suggests, are extremely good and extremely competent at driving. So having someone say, actually, it's safer for you to drive if you aren't on the phone, or it's safer for you to drive while wearing a seatbelt, most people will say, well, actually, I'm really good at it, so I don't need someone telling me what to do, because most of my day-to-day experiences of driving while on the phone or not wearing a seatbelt haven't actually caused a crash. So in some contexts, we feel a very strong sense of control and a strong sense of agency, and if someone is imposing on that, then that's where we become extremely angry and we react against that. So it's interesting that it's hard to really predict what situations there are where people feel a very strong sense of agency, don't want it threatened by laws or the state or the government telling them what to do. And in other cases, we feel actually we don't have very much control. So eating habits or exercise seems to be one where we feel that we're not very good at self-control. So it's an interesting aspect of what it is that means that in some cases we feel very strong sense of agency, in other cases we actually don't feel like we have very much at all.
Now, one of the phrases that you use is this sense of agency or sense of control, and the book refers to the very interesting literature on depressed people and this notion of illusion of control. I wonder if you could say a little bit about the experimental evidence here, because it looks like that depressed people have a more accurate view of how much control any of us has over our lives, and the rest of us who aren't clinically depressed have positive illusions of control. In other words, because it's an illusion, it's not accurate, but maybe one of the reasons we're not depressed is because we run around with a positive illusion or maybe even delusion about how much control we have. So it's a fascinating literature because one of the few areas where a person with a psychiatric disorder is more accurate in their perception of the world than people without a psychiatric disorder.
Yes, so this is often touted as an example of precisely that, which is that the real state of the world is one where we don't have control, and depressed patients have more accurate, aligned view of the world, which is that they don't actually that we don't actually have control, and that most of us that aren't depressed are, as you say, deluded. Actually, so the way the experiment was set up, all people had to do was press a button to try and make something happen. But the relationship between pressing the button and something happening was completely random. So you didn't actually have any control over what was being generated. Now, the depressed patients noticed this fact, whereas the non-depressed didn't. So they still felt that on occasions when they pressed things and accidentally something happened which was in line with what they predicted, they took this as evidence for control. Now, one way of viewing it is exactly as you just said, which is that depressed patients have a more accurate view of the world. The other thing to maybe a different way of perceiving this is that actually most people day-to-day experiences of pressing buttons mean that you press a button and something actually does happen. So when you press the light switch, the light does actually come on. So we have priors, so our prior experiences, which we bring to the lab. So we're perceiving the world, in the lab case it's inaccurate, but in the real world it is reasonably accurate. The depressed patients actually have prior experiences which are negative, so that is they're perceiving the world as if they can't control it. So when they come into this very specialized lab situation, their view is correct, but that doesn't mean to say that the real world operates in such a way that we don't actually have control, because most of the time when we press buttons things do happen. So I think it's a nice story to tell. It's the way it's sold in sort of the popular domain, but actually I don't think it's an accurate one. I think what we have to consider is the prior experiences we bring to the lab and how that fits with what this particular situation is that's created. So it's not like those who aren't depressed have a biased or deluded view of the world. I'd say they don't. I'd say what your experiences are will shape the way you perceive the world, but most of the time your day-to-day experiences are ones where you do actually have control.
So one of the really interesting things about your book and your paper is that you take famous psychology experiments and kind of conclusions that arise from them that often seep into popular science books and the public imagination, and you critique the experiment. You rigorously go back and look at the experiment and say, well, hang on a second, maybe people have extrapolated too much from this experiment. What really can we extrapolate? Let's keep our feet on the ground. And let's take an example, a famous Malcolm Gladwell book, Blink, and he's become associated with an idea that it's better to let your intuition or your unconscious make decisions as opposed to your conscious mind. And you've critiqued that, I think, very comprehensively, certainly in the paper. Could you say something about that?
Well, what Malcolm Gladwell's book is based on is a number of very popular psychological demonstrations in which it seems like our intuition can lead us into a better situation. We make better decisions than if we think. In fact, what he would be arguing is that sometimes we overthink, and that leads us into bad decisions. So some of the psychological demonstrations of that. So do you want me to go into details for some of the experiments that are referred to support
if
this?
you could, yeah.
So one of the most famous and the most controversial is the work by a Dutch psychologist called House. And what he showed was he set up a number of different contexts in which people had to make consumer choices. So they had to decide which car to buy. Now, in the complicated situations that people were presented with, they had a lot of information to think about when comparing each of these cars to figure out which one is the right car to buy. Now, what in this very elegant experiment, what House did was he got half the people to think very hard, very deliberately over the choice that they wanted to make. So think which car was the best car to buy. The other group were told to go away and fill anagrams. So they were told to not deliberately think about which car to buy. They were distracted. What he found was that actually those people who were distracted and then came back and made a snap decision about which car to buy made the better choice more often than those who had spent a long time deliberating over which choice to make. Now, you can undermine that experiment on a number of levels. So what I think is a good car to buy may be very different from what the experimenter decides is the right car to buy. So that's one thing. The other thing is that actually, and a more critical issue, is the significant numbers of failures to replicate that finding. So there are at least 20 or so studies in independent labs that have failed to find that very notable effect that House had shown. So it's appealing because it's great to think that actually in any of these major choices that we have to make in complicated situations, it's better to sort of sleep on it or leave it to our unconscious rather than to spend time figuring out what to do, when actually the most reliable psychological evidence is telling you precisely to think very carefully about what it is that you plan to do. So the snappy findings of House, which have been overplayed by people like Malcolm Gladwell and many other popular science books, is a great story to tell people because it sounds so dramatic and it's something that we might actually want to hear, but no one really wants to hear the rather humdrum, boring version, which is actually those findings are unreliable, and actually in order to make a good decision, you have to actually think very hard about what to do. So that's why I've spent some time trying to unpick these things and present an alternative, because I think it's a responsibility that science has to provide lots of different ideas and explanations for our day-to-day experiences in the world. And the most popular one doesn't necessarily mean it's the right one.
And another good example of this is in the stuff in the book around subliminal advertising. And I have to say that in terms of reading about the rigorous scientific evidence on subliminal advertising, the section in the book on this is masterful in helping people get to an understanding of where we are on subliminal advertising. So again, there was one study, or an apparent study, I mean, you even cast doubt as to findings of that study, that seemed to suggest that presenting a product as an image too rapidly on a screen for the human brain to pick it up consciously led to consumer choices where consumers would pick that product.
Yeah.
But in fact, there's been a singular inability to replicate that finding, and also, even when it's replicated where people have to make a decision really rapidly after seeing the material, or not seeing the material, hours or days later. The ability of a subliminal advert to have any impact on your choice is really very small. It degrades very quickly.
Yes.
Could you say something about that?
Well, again, I think so I have access to looking at these findings and studying them. I think maybe one interesting point is, why is it that the idea that subliminal advertising actually exists still pervades? I mean, when in fact it actually is a myth. So, I teach this to my undergraduates, and I asked them, do you believe that subliminal advertising works? And all of them unanimously say yes. And when I actually say, well, this is really based on a very early finding by a marketeer, in fact, he wasn't even a psychologist, and he had claimed that he'd set up these devices in cinemas where images would be flashed up and people would be persuaded after the film, so assuming that a film lasts, say, maybe an hour and a half or so, after the film they'd go off and buy Coke or more popcorn and so on. But later it turned out, and he fessed up that it was a hoax. He didn't actually have any evidence to show that this worked. So when the people that owned the cinema were interviewed, they said there wasn't any difference in sales of any of the items that were flashed up subliminally. Now, since that time, people still seem to have a belief that it still works. So in very careful experimental demonstrations of this, there is no reliable evidence that you can influence people's consumer behavior by presenting something at a subliminal level. So we're talking presenting flashes of images of either brands or the actual item itself at between 17 to 30 or 40 milliseconds. It just doesn't stay as a strong representation in the mind long enough for us to then go and perform an action, which means go find the object that we had been subliminally instructed to buy and then go and buy it. There's just no evidence to show that actually that works at all.
Now, another part of the book is about the fact that we often resolve to try and bring more control into our lives. That we try to resolve to eat less or diet more and lose weight. And we start off with good resolve, and then things deteriorate. And you outline a series of very interesting, elegant experiments where people have to choose or are presented with nice chocolate biscuits and then also radishes, and are told they can't eat the chocolate biscuits and they have to eat the radishes. And this sense of trying to maintain control seems to wear people down, and they don't persist in a difficult task afterwards than compared to people who are allowed to eat the chocolate biscuits. So this notion that self-control is something that absorbs energy and leaves you somehow depleted. Could you say something about that, and also the difference between the kind of motivational model, or what I think you call the strength model, in explaining this finding?
Right, so I'm going to sound like a broken record here, unfortunately, which is that, so the strength model seems to fit very nicely with our general folk psychological idea about these things, which is that we like to do things that can be bad for our health. So we like drinking, we like smoking, we like eating fatty foods, things that seem tasty but actually are bad for our health. And to try to exercise a degree of self-control, which is that we try to stop ourselves from doing those things, have been tested in the lab. And through several demonstrations, the idea is that the amount of energy needed to impose self-control depletes our glucose resources. So this is why it's called a strength model. So the more we try to impose self-control, the more energy we need, so the more glucose we drain, because it actually is quite a physical experience. And so the demonstration of this is that when you try to exercise self-control, when you then have to go off and do other things, your energy is spent, so you're not very good at doing other stuff. Now, unfortunately, as I said, I'm going to sound like a broken record here, but the evidence to support this is also unreliable. So there are many other demonstrations, there are many other attempts to demonstrate this, and they haven't been able to replicate these effects. Or there are many alternative ways of actually trying to explain this, which doesn't depend on this strength model. So I'm not undermining the idea that it's actually difficult to impose self-control. What I would say is that in order to, the ease with which you can exact self-control is determined by, one, your your sense of agency, and the other is your value system. So the more important it becomes for you to be healthy, the more efforts you take in being healthy and performing actions, these become part of your routine, your habit, because you value these things more. So and if you have a strong sense of control, sense of agency, then you feel that you can actually do more about getting into positions that make you feel healthier and are actually healthier. So that doesn't necessarily depend on this idea of the strength model, which also would say that a lot of this stuff, the problems of exacting self-control, are the result of unconscious mechanisms which are very hard to access consciously, which dictate or direct your behavior, which is why it's very difficult to exact self-control. And I would say that's not the issue. The issue is bringing to the fore the things that really are important to you and increasing one's sense of agency. That's the way to go in trying to get people to have more self-control.
So we're running out of time, but I think it's very important we talk a little bit about a very famous series of experiments that you comment on again in the book and in the paper, the Liber Experiments, where people are asked to make a decision or make a choice, and a recording is made of when they are aware of having made that decision, and that's compared with brain activity linked to that decision. And it looks, at first glance from this data and other data from functional MRI studies, that the brain or our brains are actually making a decision before we do. And we seem to think we've made a decision, but actually the brain made a decision significant time, though short, before we made the decision. And this goes to the heart of the problem of agency and control, which is, do we really have agency and control, or are we suffering from an illusion that we think we have, but actually something else is in control, like our environment or maybe our brains? Now, could you say something about these experiments, because they have dominated the popular imagination and also, to some extent, scientific thinking about agency and control?
Yes, I think this particular experiment has been a sticking point because somehow or other it resonates very well with what we may on a folk psychological level seem to think is what's going on. But so just to explain how the experiment's set up. So if you're a participant in Liber's experiment, all you have is in front of you is a clock, and it's speeded. And the arm, you've only got one arm on the clock, and there's a little red spot and it moves round. And Liber says to you, all you need to do is tell me when you feel the urge to press a button, and there's a button in front of you, and then when you feel the urge, tell me. So point at where the arm was on the clock, and then press the button. Now, at the same time, what he's doing is he's measuring electrical activity, so the potential to generate what's needed to at a motor level to produce this response.
In the brain?
In the brain, exactly, in the brain. And so what he very elegantly shows is that the build-up to making a decision to press the button, the feeling that you have, is pinpointed about 300 milliseconds, which is, as you say, rather short, but in psychological terms it's actually rather a long time. It's happening earlier than your conscious experience, which suggests that, and this is the argument he makes, that our conscious thoughts don't have causal efficacy. It's our brains that are actually dictating what we do. And the only thing that we can do at a conscious level is veto that. So it's almost like what happens is at an unconscious level, the neural activity is generating us and directing us towards a particular action. And at a conscious level, all we can do is stop that. So we veto that. So that's why he calls it free won't rather than free will. Now, there are a number of ways of undermining this experiment. So there have been some replications, but there are also evidence, depending on how you set the experiment up, which show that actually our conscious thought is precisely the thing that is determining what we do. So it's not something that's happening at an unconscious level. That the timing of these things are perfectly aligned with our conscious thoughts. So it's not like there's something happening way earlier. Another way to think about it, though, so say if you said, okay, in Liber's case, what he's done is he's shown that for an arbitrary choice that you're making, pressing a button or not pressing a button, the electrical activity in your brain is preparing yourself to do that way earlier than you're conscious of. Well, okay, I'd be quite happy for that because it's an arbitrary choice. It becomes a bit worrying when you extend that finding to virtually everything and you say our unconscious mind is dictating our life partner, where we live, what university we study at, what job we take. You know, these are major life choices that we make. And so some in the popular science domain have extended this very limited demonstration to saying that we actually don't have any conscious free will, and all of the things that we do are dictated by our brain, which is worrying because the evidence, a lot of other psychological evidence, doesn't suggest that. It's just that I think the interesting thing is, what is it about these kinds of demonstrations that are so sticky that people seem to like to hear? Because people don't really like hearing, or you know, the less popular view is to say most of the time you actually do have control. Most of the time you should actually be responsible for your choices, and you're more likely to have better control if you have a better sense of agency. But all of this is happening at a conscious level. People don't seem to want to hear that. They'd rather consign responsibility at the unconscious level, and unfortunately a lot of popular science books at the moment are saying the very same thing.
Well, Magda, thank you very much. I'm going to ask you one final question, which may lead you to run screaming from the room, but I'm interested in the personal impact of your work on you. I'm wondering whether you were someone maybe who always did have a strong sense of agency and control over your life, and that's what drew you to this field, or is it the case that in studying it, somehow you've changed your view of your sense of agency and control? What's been the personal impact on you? Do you go about making decisions differently? Could you give us any examples of where you might have made different decisions in your personal life as a result of your reading of this literature?
Oh, well, it's an interesting question to ask. Actually, I think it's been posed to me on a number of occasions by my friends. It's hard to know whether this is self-selected. So as someone that may have or thinks they have a strong sense of agency, then goes into a field and studies that and then recommends that that's the case. It could be that's one way of explaining it. The other is that it's mostly through observation, actually. So I observe how things work in the world, my experiences of other people as well, and this has been sort of a happy coincidence with the areas of research such as decision making, learning, control and so on, which have revealed interesting and sometimes very controversial ideas. So has that impacted my life? I think it's helped strengthen my general understanding of things, and I think I'm someone that likes to question what the popular view is and unpack it and see what it is. And for me, these two things, agency and control, are very important issues, and I see that they're important in my own life as well. And I don't know whether it's massively changed what I do, but it's helped me understand the things that I do a bit better. I think there was another question in there, and what maybe, I don't know whether I answered that properly, but anyway.
Well, no, thank you for that. Again, I know that we discussed this before, and we were thinking that maybe it might get too technical, but I still want to have a go at talking a little bit about the Daniel Dennett example you bring up in the book, about how you could be watching a crime thriller movie and the folk understanding of the characters and the plot is one where you try to predict what's going to happen next in the plot by working out the motivation of the characters and the plot structure. But Daniel Dennett says that the neuroscience understanding of the crime thriller is kind of like the people who wrote the script, the way that the camera angle is set up, the director's instructions. So I think, and you're going to correct me, I'm sure, if I've got this wrong or I'm being too simplistic, what Daniel Dennett is saying, that the neuroscientific understanding of human behavior, or should we put it another way, a deeper understanding of human behavior, means that you're understanding along a completely different set of rules as to the folk understanding or the novelistic understanding of human behavior. They're just parallel explanations that may not intersect at all.
Yes. So the crime film or the crime drama is an analogy of the problem that Dennett presents. So Dennett's argument is that in many other disciplines of science, physics, for instance, doesn't build a theory of the physical world based on folk physical ideas of the world, because how we understand gravity is very different from how physicists conceptualize gravity, because they don't depend on or rely on the folk idea of that. So he's saying, well, the same should apply with issues to do with trying to understand human behavior. We have folk psychological ideas, but they shouldn't be the basis for which science, psychology or cognitive science, tries to understand how people go about things. So the crime drama was a useful analogy of this, which is that when we watch a crime drama, there are things that we pay attention to which are precisely built on our folk psychological understanding of the world, how people behave, how people act, their intentions, and so on, because that's the way we tend to see or interpret the world around us. But what we aren't paying attention to is the production, the lighting, the editing, and so on, which are all of the things that contribute to constructing something which we see as meaningful and we can interpret in a certain way. So the folk psychology view of trying to understand the crime drama and how people interact is not the basis for how we should actually understand what the experience is. What we need to know is what it is about the lighting, the direction, and so on, the context, the environment, the neuropsychological aspect of it. So this area in between, which is the folk psychological ideas that we have, aren't a useful starting point. They only should have a place within the popular domain, but not in the science domain. So we have to reconceptualize all of these things and ignore all of this folk psychological stuff, because it doesn't actually help us to understand human behavior very well. I mean, other people will argue that that's not the case. So what he was suggesting was not right, and actually these things are useful concepts, and they do help us predict and understand human behavior. So that's part of a philosophical debate, and also a sort of maybe scientific debate, but not necessarily one that probably touches on or matters to many other people outside of those circles, I suspect.
Well, Magda Osman, thank you very much indeed. It's been a fascinating conversation. Just to run over the references we've been using this evening. So Magda Osman has published a fascinating paper entitled Does Our Unconscious Rule? It's in the February 2015 edition of The Psychologist. Also, she's written a brilliant book entitled Future Minded, The Psychology of Agency and Control, written by Magda Osman and published by Palgrave Macmillan. And I thoroughly recommend the book and the paper. Magda, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.